I was teaching undergrads back then, and I'm like, they've missed their first year, they've missed their second year. And then I remember when we then went back to the classroom, they were just unable to exist normally. Like, I vividly remember this girl picking up a phone call in class, and I was like, do you mind taking it outside? And she was like, but it's important. And I was like, I'm not telling you not to take it. I'm just telling you not to take it while I'm speaking. Another person like speaking on the phone under the table while I was speaking, and I was just like, what is happening? But again, like, it feels like they almost missed that transition from high school into like early adulthood. So yeah, like they've just, I feel like, yeah, we remember a bit of joy, and then the crisis started, while for them, they were born into them. So it's been really, really hard. They have been robbed of those years in which you could essentially form yourself when the world was less scary.
Dr. Carolina Are is an innovation fellow and a social media researcher at Northumbria University's Center for Digital Citizens. Dr. Are, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Really nice to meet you. And you can call me Carolina. It's less of a mouthful.
Yes, I was hoping you'd say that. Carolina, I wrote to you, what was it? I think it was last week, because I read an absolutely scandalous article in The Guardian, an article I obviously took very personally. You are, of course, heavily featured in it, luckily providing some much needed relief for my sore, burning wounds after I read that piece. Our listeners might be wondering, what the hell am I talking about? And I'm talking about a piece with the following title: Cringe, How Millennials Became Uncool. Ouch. Now, it's important to add that this isn't the author's opinion. In fact, as a millennial herself, I think she's sort of grappling with this perception, as I hope we will during this conversation. Full disclosure, obviously, I am a cart-carrying millennial myself, and one that refuses to be deemed completely washed or discarded to the rubbish heap of uncool history. But before we talk about this predominantly digital beef between Zoomers and millennials, I wanted to put my skeptic hat on just a little bit and ask something much more, I suppose, elementary. Do you think that grouping people by generations like this makes sense in the first place? Because part of me thinks, yeah, of course it does. Members of a particular generation grew up through the same times together, which must mean something, right? But another part of me thinks that maybe other categories, such as, I don't know, top of the hat, nationality, political leanings, gender, might be just as valid, if not more valid. For example, a Zoomer, let's say born to an aristocratic family in England, is going to have a completely different upbringing and then indeed life than a kid born to parents in Norilsk, Russia, where everyone is a minor and life expectancy is 55 years old. I was wondering what your take on that was.
I should probably start by saying that I'm also a millennial myself. So when it comes to maybe like research rigor, I think some people would like to add limitations to their study and say, we should probably flag that the author is from X and Y demographic. This is my positionality. So I should say that I am a millennial woman born in 1992. So maybe there is a bit of bias there. But I kind of agree with you in the sense that while I do think that actually generation can be a defining factor, particularly when you're talking about use of technology, there are a lot of other things happening there and a lot of other things at play, such as gender, nationality, as you said, political leaning, sexual orientation, and also just in general, life experiences and the way you were brought up. Because I would say I am a millennial, but apart from the fact that I am cool, if I do say so myself. Also, because of the type of work that I do, both as a researcher and as a content creator, I do have to keep my finger on the pulse of like tech trends. So I've been told, for instance, that some of the things that millennials do online that are uncool, like the millennial pause, which is that pause that you do before you record something. I've been told that I don't do that much from Gen Z people. So maybe I don't know, I'm one of the cool kids. Like, I feel like, the Steve Buscemi meme, like, how you do, fellow kids? Like, this is how I feel amongst Gen Z. But yeah, like, there are loads of factors at play there. And the grouping people by generations makes sense in terms of the things that we've gone through. This is why it kind of didn't make it into the article fully, but something that I do talk about is how as millennials, we're very tired, and we're tired because we lived through a gazillion financial crashes. We inhabit incredibly unprecedented times, to the point that every time I see the "can we go back to precedented times" meme, I feel very seen. So I think, again, that makes more sense, because maybe someone from Generation X or boomers didn't live through things in the same way that we did, because maybe they didn't experience the same precarity, the same expectation in the workplace, for instance, of being always on. So I think it makes sense when it comes to life experiences, maybe use of technology, understanding of trends. But as you say, there are so many other factors at play that it is a bit reductive to just make it about the generations.
All right, so the gist of the Guardian article is that Gen Z thinks we millennials have now basically become profoundly uncool somehow. You believe that's because of the different ways we exist online. You started to talk about that a little bit already. Could you tell us a bit more about this kind of existential digital divide between the generations?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I find really interesting is that the majority of the content that I've seen about, or the majority of the discussions that I've seen about millennials being uncool, has been online and has been created by Gen Z creators or Gen Z users, or in a self-deprecating way by millennials kind of responding to that, which is kind of what the article was about. And I have a lot of Gen Z friends, and like, I think, like, I've been roasted a few times, maybe because of the way I like to take boomerangs when I go out for drinks. And they were like, "Oh my God, millennial moment." And I was like, wait a minute.
The
So
what? Sorry, I didn't catch that. Why
they
were they
just said,
roasting you?
oh, because of the way I like to take boomerangs when I go out for drinks,
What
like
does that
kind of
mean?
like, the kind of gif moment of like glasses clinking together, and then it just kind of.
Ah, I'm so millennial. I didn't even understand that. Like old school
So
millennial.
maybe it's a different phase of millennialism, and it's a very kind of like content creator heavy
Oh
kind
my
of millennial
god.
vibe. I don't
Oh
know.
Jesus.
But yeah, I've been roasted by them a few times, but to be honest, it was quite benevolent. While online, there's a lot of different types of content roasting millennials and making us self-conscious about different things. So yeah, I would say, if you think about generations roasting each other, that's really nothing new. Like, our parents criticized us, or our grandparents criticized our parents for like different reasons. This is something that has always happened. And vice versa, we would criticize them for things that they do that are uncool. But I think like the generational beef has been kept offline largely. And, I think even in the press, like what I remember is like boomers roasting millennials because, of our avocado on toast and Netflix subscriptions making us unable to buy houses. So I think it's only natural then that when you have generations that are very online, like millennials, because we were the first digital natives and adopters, and then Gen Z, who are fully born into an online world, then obviously you see these clashes playing out not so much anymore on newspaper column inches, but on content creator platforms. And I think the reason why a lot of what I said in the article about the differences between millennials and Gen Z um, revolves around aesthetics and behaviors, because I think there's something that is typically millennial in the way that we behave online, because when we came of age and platforms were suddenly a thing, it seemed to be a world of opportunity, right? Like we could use platforms to create portfolios, to start businesses. A lot of us were the first content creators and bloggers. And on top of that, platforms were a more hopeful place back then, because it was a way to
Definitely.
connect. Yeah, it was a way to connect with and keep in touch with people that were in other places in the world. I remember the Arab Spring when,
MySpace.
MySpace,
MySpace was
but
so
even
innocent. You could customize it and everything. I miss those days.
I miss those days. And it was a way of like showing your personality. Yes, in a performative way, but with your mates almost like, and even, MSN Messenger, like all of those platforms were about crafting an identity, but in a much more lo-fi way than when we
I'm
see
gonna start
now, where
crying
it's,
now. Yeah,
I know, good. Those were the days.
those were the
Like
days.
it wasn't as heavily curated. But even if you think about Facebook and Twitter, like when the Arab Spring happened, people were like, wow, these platforms can start revolutions. And obviously platforms rode the wave of that and they loved it and they made it a huge chunk of their marketing that they could help people free themselves and realize their full potential. So I think there's part of a hopefulness in our, like there's part of that hopefulness in that use that we as millennials make of platforms still, but there's also an element of that hope being crushed, where we are both like reluctant to let go of some of that use and of being very online and of posting absolutely everything and then slightly curating that experience to look more put together. But at the same time, there's a hopelessness when we're like, yeah, everything we thought about platforms is not true because of Elon and blah, while I think Gen Z, they have a humor that is a lot more meta, not the platform, but like
Yeah.
meta, the behavior, where you need to be very online to understand the meaning of those memes. But at the same time, they don't post as much, and their aesthetics are more about, Goblin mode, not being so heavily curated, because they deeply resent, for instance, the polished version of the Instagram aesthetic that we as millennials have created. But what I argued in the article is that you may create a messy and more real aesthetic, but it's still an aesthetic, because if you are mediating yourself through a platform, it's still a performance of sorts. So yeah, I think like those are some of the key differences that I discuss in the article, that are very much informed by the times that we've all lived through. And we're tired, you know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of millennials, like I've personally had to keep up with trends, but a lot of millennials don't have the time or the interest to do that anymore, because some of them are starting families. A lot of us are burnt out by all the crises that we're facing. And like learning how to be good at TikTok is maybe just not our priority.
I'm sorry, I just remembered how you said that. It might be just a generational thing. And I remember how when boomers were putting us on blast because of avocado toast or whatever, we just had that Joker card. We could just say, okay, boomer. And we were kind of, we created this Teflon around us, Yeah, I guess the
Yeah,
wheel
because
turns, I suppose.
the wheel always turns. Everything comes back to bite you in the ass, because life is just like that. But I think what's interesting is that an older generation criticizing a younger one, again, is nothing new. It's kind of like, oh, where have our morals gone, kind of thing. And it's very easy to be snarky about it and to just be like, okay, boomer, But I think when suddenly, after being the cool kids, suddenly like people remove your cool factor, it's very triggering. It's kind of like, wait, I'm young. I'm still young. How dare you?
Exactly. Um, I totally still feel this way, by the way. Okay, if we're being a bit more specific, the list of kind of millennial offenses to Zoomer sensibilities is pretty long these days. I researched it, and it goes from stuff like skinny jeans, no go, obviously, tucking in shirts, selfie techniques. Apparently, you're supposed to use the back camera now, not the front. Overuse of certain emojis, and the dreaded millennial pause, like you said, the brief moment of silence at the start of the video, there to see if the device is in fact recording or not, which can look a bit silly. Some of these are clearly internet related, but some, like what not to wear, skinny jeans, I don't know, are not. So can't we just chalk everything up to just different aesthetic preferences at the end of the day?
I feel like the whole not following trends is still a trend. I remember I was a teenage metalhead, and I made a point out of not being girly, out of not following fashion and wearing whatever you could find in a shop window, but that was still a trend. Like it's still an aesthetic. So what I would say, apart from an aesthetic, is maybe a way of being where it's kind of a rejection of polish and a rejection of rules, which maybe I think like for millennials, we were kind of on the cusp of rejecting them. Like, there's a lot of us that became digital nomads or, decided to start our own businesses and whatever, which is something that you can easily do when you're young and you're not starting a family. So that is one thing. But also in general, we still had to deal with a lot of boomer workplaces where, yes, we wanted our little corner, but at the same time, we still had to cope with the fact that our bosses were still that age. So we needed to kind of find a halfway house. While now millennials are finding themselves being bosses, and we've all gone through the pandemic, which has been like a massive shakeup of the working environment. So I think Gen Zs are also a bit more reluctant to do things by the book because of that, because a lot of them came of age during the pandemic. But I think what's really interesting when it comes to fashion and aesthetics like that, I actually dispute, like, don't get me wrong, I don't love skinny jeans, but Gen
I had a
Z
phase.
are bringing
Yeah.
back same. I mean, I was a teenage metalhead. But basically Gen Z are bringing back a lot of the 90s and even worse Y2K trends that we used to wear when we were growing up. And some of those are god awful. Like, please keep low rise jeans in the bin. So I'm kind of like, who's really that uncool if you're bringing those back? Cause we were wearing those. So all of these things are quite cyclical. And if anything, I would say that I'm struggling to see something new. Like, I'm struggling to see, like the 70s had punk, the 80s had glam, the 90s had grunge. And then Y2K was just like a puddle of everything. But I'm struggling to see something that I'm like, oh, that's too like 2010, or like that is so 2020. If anything, I'm struggling with that. Like, I'm quite curious of the fact that you can't say, oh, that is a very Gen Z aesthetic yet, apart from Goblin mode and stuff like that.
Okay. I'm sorry, we gotta talk about that. What's Goblin mode? A friend of mine, in fact, a patron of this podcast, recently said that he's going Goblin mode on X, Twitter, whatever. And I just thought that he meant that he's gonna start behaving rather poorly there, kind of not holding himself back, literally behaving like a sort of goblin or something. But now I'm thinking I might be wrong and I just don't get it.
I mean, is your friend a millennial? Is
Yeah,
he misusing Goblin?
He's a
Is he
millennial like
misusing Goblin mode as a trend?
I don't know. He's millennial like me, but I think he has, a lot of adversaries, political adversaries on Twitter, on X, and then that's what
Okay.
he meant, that he was going to be dealing with them as a sort of a goblin. But please, you tell me what that is, because I'm confused.
Basically, the term refers, this is from a Guardian article because it was the word of the year from Oxford, and from the Oxford Dictionary in 2022. So the term refers to a type of behavior which is unapologetically self-indulgent, lazy, slovenly, or greedy, typically in a way that rejects social norms or expectation. And a lot of what I've seen when it comes to the use of Goblin mode is essentially like unpolished aesthetics, just staying in bed and like basically looking a bit disheveled, which I actually kind of love. Like, sometimes I need Goblin mode because a lot of my life is quite polished, and sometimes I'm just like, no, I just need to be a goblin. But what's really interesting is the emergence of that, because I think, as I said, a lot of the Instagram aesthetic, particularly for millennials, particularly around 2016, was so polished, specific hues of colors, millennial pink, everything looking super edited and stuff. And I can see how young people could suffer from that, because it's quite an unattainable aesthetic of having to look that perfect. So I like Goblin mode as a rejection of beauty standards and of a specific aesthetic. But again, it's still an aesthetic. Like, I am still yet to see someone posting Goblin mode and not still looking a bit cute
Yeah,
or endearing.
right.
So yeah, I don't know if your friend is misusing the word or if it's being
This
very
is
self-indulgent.
millennial appropriation of like Gen Z terms, using it in a completely wrong way. So what you're saying is like concepts such as like goblin mode is a sort of a revolt against this polished aesthetics that we millennials have propped up online. I didn't even know that we're such a polished generation. That's news to me, but
I mean, I think like the social media life of millennials has gone from unintentional goblin mode to a very aesthetically pleasing look. Like, I mean, do you remember when Facebook happened and like you could just make, I don't know, albums of like 30 pictures and it'd be like of, I don't know, bins or like the the things you see on a night out, and it was completely unpolished. But then I think when Instagram took over,
ah,
even if people were not influencers, I think a lot of people still behave like influencers. So I don't know, like I feel like the influencer aesthetic is kind of creeping into everyday lives. And actually my colleague Dr. Sophie Bishop wrote a brilliant article about that called Influencer Creep, and how practices of influencing are creeping into not just everyday life, but in particular in the workplace, where we all have to create content to kind of be seen and market ourselves in a very precarious economy. And I think this is where then a lot of millennials became polished, because if you remember, there was a time where everybody was panicking about, oh my God, will my employer find my messy pictures online? So I think a lot of people are trying to mediate their persona and their social media with that in mind still. And I think Gen Z are a lot less worried about that, because I think in fairness, millennials did pave the way with social media behaviors. So I think there's a lot of rejection of that polish that we then had to embrace for a variety of reasons. And also just because we wanted to be on trend. So if you notice, like, you know, a lot of the selfie behavior criticism is that we want it to be polished, we pose in a specific way. So yeah, like we don't speak to camera as much. Like our persona is very much mediated through the picture as opposed to the video, which is more of a TikTok aesthetic that
ah.
Gen Zs have embraced more.
Wow, so kind of like images versus video. Never thought of that before, but it does make
I think
sense. Yeah,
there's a lot of that.
yeah,
I think there's a lot of images versus video. And again, we are
yeah.
generalizing
Of
here,
course.
because personally, as a millennial, I use video a lot, because that's just part of my practice, and I like of the content that I post. But yeah, I think there's a lot of that. And I think a huge part of the differences as well, and this is what I find when I speak to users, is that users are tired of the speed with which new platforms are kind of rising and falling. And a lot of millennials are very tired of having to keep up. And at the same time, a lot of Gen Zs are pretty crushed by this constant need to mediate everything. And it's quite interesting to see a lot of Gen Zs saying, actually, we want to stay offline, or like we want to get a dumb phone as opposed to a
Mm.
smartphone, because the damages of a very online life are now being seen.
But again, when you were explaining, I have a thought. Again, it's kind of cyclical. You know, you said like when Facebook first came up, we had like pictures of bins and stuff, just stuff, really like trashy, literally trashy stuff that we saw around us. And then the polished thing, and now we're kind of back to the trashy thing again, right? So again, nothing new,
Mm, mm,
but
mm.
this sort of like a cyclical thing reappearing again, in a way.
I think so. And I think, yeah, a cyclical thing reappearing. I think also something to do with the times, right? Because I think before, like pre 2016, there was definitely more of a hopefulness in the world. Not because horrible things weren't happening, but I feel like 2016 with Brexit and Trump, we've seen a complete change of the way that platforms can be used. And it's basically been getting worse since then. So I don't know, Western society seems to be in its flop era. So it's quite interesting to then see a lot of content kind of, again, indulging in the lack of polish and in the kindness to oneself. and in stopping to feed the machine, which I think, to be honest, Gen Z are a lot more mindful of in certain circles. Like, I think like Gen Z, and again, generalizing here, but Gen Z women are very politically active. And then if you look at the voting for Trump in the US, a lot of people that voted for them were Gen Z young men. So yeah, there's a bit of decadence in society in general that I think is mirrored to those, like, through those trends as well.
Interesting. I also thought, is it maybe that Zoomers are simply also more technically proficient in social media use since they grew up kind of with it? I mean, I got my first phone when I was 15, and the only thing I could do with it was call, and call quickly because calling was expensive, or send a really short text. For years, the screen of the phone literally accommodated one line of text. So no wonder my selfies now are a bit more rusty than the selfies of someone who's been snapping them since they were 4 years old or something.
Yeah, there's that. I feel like digital adoption is a lot, like, happens a lot sooner for Gen Z. And again, so my expertise, actually, rather than it being like generational behaviors, is actually the use of platforms, how people use platforms, how platforms affect people, and how platforms are governed. So I think something that is happening and that is increasingly interesting to me is that we are now interrogating the making of platforms, their design, how addictive they are. And again, it makes me wonder, like, these kids are growing up with platforms and with apps and phones since a very, very young age, to the point where their parents sometimes just give it to them because it's the thing to do. Everybody else has them. And it's also a very easy way of keeping them entertained. But now we are catching up with that, and we are seeing the damage of that, which again is why this kind of like food really interests me, because I wonder if it's almost like an uproar from Gen Z being like, all of these things that you believe in, like, or that you thought you believed in, they're actually quite harmful, and they have been for us growing up. So it's deeply uncool that you care about being online so much and that you're not disconnecting.
Oh, wow. Okay. By the way, you're a social media researcher, so your finger, like you said, is on the pulse of these sort of changing attitudes. In this case, on millennials. When would you say the scales kind of started tipping against our favor here in the realm of coolness, and why? And we poor millennials began to be considered much more uncool than before.
I can't pinpoint a specific time, but I think like the end of the lockdowns has been a critical moment, I think, because I think like that's when a lot of millennials suddenly became adults. I think, like, to be honest, I'm not an adult. I'm still 16 in my head.
Same.
But a lot of great. But yeah, like, I think a lot of millennials, when by the time the pandemic ended, a lot of millennials were cohabiting with their partners in serious relationships. They'd had a baby or two. And like, maybe, either they had a stable job, or they were in the process of getting one, or a mortgage. And I think that's when a lot of people kind of decided to maybe disconnect from the trends, because a lot of the pandemic was about staying online, because that was the only way to stay connected to the rest of the world. And that's kind of when TikTok became huge and stuff like that. But I think probably like a lot of people's lives shifted after the pandemic. And obviously with Gen Z being younger, some of them being at university, some of them just hitting the job market and coming out and working again. I think that's probably when the divide started a little bit, because our lives started really diverging. And then maybe, millennials found themselves going out and adopting those behaviors that were now deeply uncool. And Gen Z started noticing, like, now that as soon as life started opening up again, Gen Z started noticing that we did things because we haven't kept up.
But I don't know. I don't have that many millennial friends who are just like buying houses and like having their life completely in order, and just wherever I look around me, just one big shit show in my generation. Like you said, a lot of people are tired. A lot of people are burnt out. A lot of people feel hopeless. Not a lot of like joy. Definitely not a stream of constant parades and having it like amazing. for ourselves out there. I don't know. So I kind of don't understand if this is indeed envy from Gen Z. Where is it coming from?
I don't think it is envy, to be honest. I think it's more, yeah, it's just a different life stage. And I think because we haven't kept up and we are the easiest target because we are still online, we still behave like that, we are still visible. I think it's quite easy to be like, well, actually, yeah, we don't do it like that. But I don't think it's necessarily envy at all. And yeah, you're right. Like, not a lot of millennials now can afford to buy houses, but I think a lot of millennials' lives really shifted at the end of the pandemic, definitely in the UK and definitely in London. Like, I think a lot of people moved out of London because they realized that having a house was important to them. And they couldn't afford it in the capital. So they stopped doing, they stopped being 365 party girls and they started doing other stuff. But yeah, like I really don't think it's envy actually. I think it's just more noticing something and just being like, yeah, we don't do it like that.
Fair enough. Okay, there's a lot of talk of cringe in this article and in this discourse about millennials. By cringe, what exactly do we mean? Now I have to be careful because I already misunderstood Goblin mode. So I have to ask about all of these like pretty basic words. By cringe, what do we mean? Or what do Zoomers mean?
I think they mean, and now I'm just going to be canceled by Zoomers and
It's
just going to
worth
be
it.
like, oh, a typical old millennial behavior. But yeah, like, I don't know, it's when something that someone does
Okay, yeah,
makes you
yeah,
go
yeah.
like a bit like,
That's what I
ooh,
thought. Okay.
like it's a bit embarrassing that people would behave in like a specific way, right? And yeah, like it's almost when you get the ick about someone, but you get it because of a
Mm.
generational thing.
When I was growing up, we had some sort of like cringe limit that we tried to hit. Like making people cringe more was kind of cool for us. So I'm sort of wondering if it's like the opposite now with Gen Z, that they're really, really sensitive to any sort of moment of cringe, that
Mm.
it's really undesirable in any circumstance.
I think there's a struggle of being
As
perceived.
cringe.
And I get it. Well, not just as cringe, of being perceived.
Oh,
Full stop, like
yeah.
in general. Because I think like the challenge of the online world that now is part of our working lives and our personal lives and our entertainment is that you can go viral overnight. Like, you can be heavily perceived. You can have an audience that you didn't think you'd have. And I've had that, like during the pandemic or just at the end of it, my TikTok went massively viral and I woke up like to 1 million views overnight. And I was like, what? I did get something out of it for a while. I was getting brand partnerships and like some stuff, but now I'm heavily shadow banned because of what I post. So, nobody cares. For people that don't follow me, I'm a pole dance performer, and obviously platforms don't like it because boobs are
What?
scary when somebody think of the
Oh,
children. But anyway, yeah, that's another aspect of platforms that I don't love, the censorship. So basically it's quite scary to be perceived all of a sudden because you have an audience and you have to act in a different way. And I think a lot of Gen Zs are very aware of the audience and the visibility and
so
things
you
that
have to be
come with
careful
that
about like
visibility.
cringe in particular, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, cringe in particular, but also getting canceled, like adopting wrong political behaviors. And I think something that we notice, for instance, in our community, in the pole dance world, is that people hold each other up to a huge, like a very high standard. And I notice some millennials being like, if I see someone behaving in a problematic way, I will send them a direct message and be like, hey, like, actually, that was not cool. But what a lot of younger pole dancers do is that they will screenshot it and then just like cancel them publicly. So again, it's a fine line. It's a fine line that a lot of people are like treading with their online behavior, with their feeling perceived. And then all of a sudden, a lot of people will have behaviors online that are like a bit of a persona, but then offline, they become really shy because, their persona is larger than life. It's almost like an alter ego, a performer identity. But then there's that struggle of being perceived offline and of being yeah,
constantly kind
reached
of
out
being
to
under a
almost.
microscope. So you have to be calculating with your every
Yeah,
move. It sounds like a massive headache, to be honest.
it is. And I think, nobody is trained for that. And particularly like younger people, like imagine just like growing up in that public eye and under that scrutiny. Like something that I am quite grateful when it comes to our generation is that when we grew up, popularity wasn't quantifiable, and now it kind of is. You literally have numbers of followers and views, but also in general, it's very easy to film somebody and, you know, put their stuff everywhere. So again, I understand why Gen Z's cringe about our online behavior, because it's like, do you not know the harms surrounding all of this? And I think we do, but I think, I don't know, I wonder if we're in denial and we're still stuck with our, hopeful social media behavior of the olden days, with full knowledge that actually things are going pretty bad.
Mm. If we flip the tables of this kind of generational online warfare a little bit, some of my fellow millennials that I talk to seem to have their own a bit unflattering take on Gen Z, namely that they're sort of insular and odd, totally addicted to screens, and somewhat lazy, I've heard. So, what are some of the challenges you would say that Zoomers are dealing with that the rest of us were spared?
Well, I think like we are a bit addicted to screens ourselves, but we didn't grow up with them. And I feel like there's not enough, there haven't been enough studies on the behavior modification of using apps and social media platforms and phones. And when those will start being published, I'm really curious to see the outcomes of those, because I'm not surprised. Do you know what I mean? Like, again, if what connects you to other people is in there, you are going to make use of that. And I think it does suck out a lot of time out of your life. Like I notice when I use platforms more, sometimes I could be doom scrolling and an hour has gone past.
Worse in
So
my
if that
case.
is all
Yeah.
you know, yeah, if that is all you know, and nobody has educated you about digital literacy, because schools are so far behind with that, because boomers are in government and they're way further behind on that, then of course you're going to appear lazy and you're going to work less because your time is sucked out. And I don't know, like I find it something that I really struggle with in the discourse surrounding technology is that individuals are often blamed. And don't get me wrong, if you go and abuse people online, yes, you as an individual, that's your fault. But I find it really striking in my field when then, we're talking about regulation for platforms. We always regulate the user. This is what you as a user shouldn't do. You shouldn't do X, Y, Z. But when we're talking about platform regulation, there isn't enough talk about making platforms transparent about the running of their processes, of their algorithms, their earnings, all the things that they don't tell us about. And it seems like a game of whack-a-mole where governments are trying to sort the latest trendy online harm issue, but not the system of platforms and how they run, and the fact that they can create incredibly addictive designs without anybody saying anything about it. And that has an impact on the generations that we are raising. And it has an impact not just in terms of how much they're using their phones. It has an impact when it comes to their beliefs. And I think we're actually quite unkind to younger generations, because we're always like, oh, these stupid kids. But actually, in my research, I've found that the biggest believers of online conspiracy theories and misinformation are actually boomers. So are generations that are not digital natives, and they don't know how to use phones, and they can't tell a fabricated item from a real news item, while more often than not young people can. And so I think we need to cut them some slack. And we need to really investigate the system of platforms instead of kind of keeping our feet in two shoes and being like, okay, so we really want to get rid of the bad platform stuff, but at the same time, we want platforms to invest in our countries and to, create jobs in our countries and stuff like that. Like, we need to be really serious here. And platforms and big tech need to be treated like the business that they are. And they do have a civic function, but at the same time, they are really changing the fabric of society. And we're seeing that in our behavior and the behavior of young people.
Poor boomers. I just saw a video recently, like an AI generated Jesus, very realistic looking, like flying around in heaven and having a party, and a comment there with a lot of likes saying like, I showed this to my grandma and she thought it's real. And I mean, this is not going to get better probably, right? With new AI models and stuff like this.
No.
And you see, we all have aunts and uncles like on Facebook sharing absolute nonsense, AI generated slop and believing it and like trying to proselytize it. And it's just like we're living in completely different worlds. Seems quite dystopian.
We are, and there's a lot of talk of enshittification of the internet, where the internet is just getting flooded with AI crap and all sorts of stuff. And I think, a lot of talk surrounding digital literacy is about young people and how young people should be taught stuff in schools, which I believe is right. But first of all, who's teaching them? Is it their boomer teachers? Hopefully not. And second of all, who's teaching boomers? Because boomers still have huge spending power. They still have massive voting power. And it's quite concerning that they will be making decisions about generations to come without really understanding the world that we live in, because a lot of that world happens online. Like, when Brat Summer happened and then Kamala Harris started using that in her campaign, I had to explain to my parents what Brat was. And I
had to look it up.
And wait,
I wasn't even 40 then.
Wait,
Sorry.
Don't you live in Berlin?
I do, but Berlin is more techno,
Yeah, but I feel like Brat has an element of that as an aesthetic, I don't. But anyway.
Okay, yeah, I'm just I'm getting old.
Fair enough. No, I don't know. Like, I just. It was so funny because I was just like, okay, so Brat, like, how do we do this? And like, it just came to a point where I was like, you guys are just not as online as I am. Like, there are so many more memes that you need to see before you realize what this means. So yeah, there's an element of that where, people need to be really online to understand things. And obviously a lot of boomers are not. And in a way that kind of cuts them off from public discourse. And I'm not saying that you need to be super online to understand the world, but it is quite concerning when a lot of online trends and beliefs and information runs in circles online to the point where we don't know where it comes from. We don't know how it got there. And then it influences political decisions. Like, the digital literacy aspect needs to stop being focused on young people alone.
I just thought of something. You said that, Gen Z realized that a lot of this online stuff is harmful because they grew up with it. Do you think that then they have more sympathy for like boomers, because boomers are not spending much time online that they do towards us millennials?
Oh, I don't know, actually, to be honest. I haven't seen any Gen Z person talking about
they don't even care
about boomer in the way that we do. But yeah, I mean, I haven't had this conversation. I wonder if they're so far removed from them. I actually haven't thought of that. Something that's really interesting and missing from this scenario and the article is Gen X. How are they getting away scot-free? Are they the ultimate cool generation? Like, this is something that's really interesting to me. Although my ex was a Gen Xer, and it was quite interesting to have conversations, like having to explain online trends to him. I remember one of my favorite things was I was walking in a park in Hackney and I was like, oh, I just saw FKA Twigs, the singer. And he was like, what's an...
I know her.
Yay. Yeah. Okay, good. He was like, what's an FKA Twig? I was like, oh. But yeah, like, I don't know. I just feel like Gen Xers are getting away with that because they feel like they were online, but not as online as we are.
what were they even famous for, Gen X? They're so sort of mysterious. Like, I don't know what sort of concepts or trends or aesthetics are they
I
associated
don't
with.
know, like what comes to mind is like Bret Easton Ellis, some grunge,
Ah, yes.
stuff like that.
I see. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. We said that before, but to be fair, the world that Zoomers grew up in seems much more joyless than the one we grew up in. I think like the 90s or like beginning of 2000s are quickly becoming universally recognized as what people call peak civilization, kind of like a sort of more innocent pre-internet era or innocent internet era where some of the best movies and other pop culture products were born. Even as someone from the Balkans originally, and we literally lived through a war in the early 90s. I totally still remember that decade super fondly. And Gen Z have totally missed all that and were flung directly into the world of like algorithms and selfies and the pressure of social media and stuff. So in that way, I do feel kind of bad for them.
Yeah, me too. Because again, I think also a lot of these people were really robbed of maybe like their late teens or early 20s because of the pandemic. And I vividly remember like I was finishing my PhD, and so the last year of my PhD was basically all online. But I was just imagining, I was teaching undergrads back then, and I'm like, they've missed their first year, they've missed their second year. And then I remember when we then went back to the classroom, they were just unable to exist normally. Like, I vividly remember this girl picking up a phone call in class, and I was like, do you mind taking it outside? And she was like, but it's important. And I was like, I'm not telling you not to take it. I'm just telling you not to take it while I'm speaking. Another person like speaking on the phone under the table while I was speaking, and I was just like, what is happening? But again, like, it feels like they almost missed that transition from high school into like early adulthood. So yeah, like they've just, I feel like, yeah, we remember a bit of joy, and then the crisis started, while for them, they were born into them. So it's been really, really hard. They have been robbed of those years in which you could essentially form yourself when the world was less scary. But I think also, they're a lot more conscious for some other things. A lot of them don't drink, for instance, which I find quite interesting. um I used to teach when I used to teach my criminology class, and I was talking about the nighttime economy. It was such a nightmare because I'd be like, yeah, so pubs, and they'd be like, we don't go to pubs, we don't drink. And I was just like, I'm just trying to make a connection here. What do I do? So yeah, I don't know. Like that there are a lot of points of divergence there, as much as there are points of connection. But I think I always bring it back to the times we live through, the technologies we use, and how we use them, because a lot of that has shaped us more than saying Gen Z, millennials, for the simple, name, but more because of the things we've been through.
There's another kind of sad thing that I couldn't help but notice. I watched a couple of like TED Talks, TED videos about Gen Z, and nearly all of them say that the best thing about Gen Z is how entrepreneurial they are 24/7, and that we should take advantage of this of this fact. Kind of sinister. In one of the older talks that I watched, the speaker said sort of proudly how amazed she was when she recently met a 4-year-old who was already running her own business. Now, as a bit of an Eastern European commie, I find this to be quite nightmarish. I played with other kids outside until dark every day, until I was a teenager, and then these kids were kind of expected to raise venture capital for their startups or something.
It is really sinister, as you said. And I was just watching, there's a Netflix documentary called Bad Influence, which, to be honest, I think it's pretty bad. I didn't enjoy the documentary because it's about child influencers, and a particular child influencer
Oh God.
whose mother was apparently quite exploitative, not just to her, but of the house of creators that she started representing. And I feel like it's a very, the way the documentary is made, blames this parent alone and removes responsibility from all the other parents who essentially were down for their kids working a lot of hours at a really young age for the sake of fame. And I think, to be honest, what we're seeing with child influencers in general, with child influencers in particular, but in general with a lot of child entrepreneurs and this whole idea of like entrepreneurship through new media and like at a young age in general, is that while before you had like child celebrities, the notion and availability of fame has now become more accessible because you don't necessarily need to be an actor. You could be an influencer, you could be a content creator. And so for parents that really thrive off of their children becoming famous, and even for kids whose life goal is becoming famous, then they enter a world where initially it's all fun and games, and then they don't have the control because they're slaves to the algorithm and to the entrepreneurship that they've built, the enterprise that they've built. So in a way, we are witnessing what maybe we would have witnessed in the past with a handful of child stars, but now that is being expanded to everyone. And there are very few checks and balances to protect those people. There's a lot of colleagues of mine in the US who are working towards child influencer laws. But in general, a lot of this is largely unscripted because platforms have grown so fast. And we as a society are catching up, and laws are very much catching up or need to catch up. And I think we are fully unaware of how that is changing us. And I'd like to bring it back to travel, for instance, in how platforms really are shaping life, because you know how a lot of beautiful areas in the world are struggling with over tourism. And this is because we see locations on social media and we all want to go there. And then you will see the average traveler who is not an influencer, who is not sponsoring anything, behave like an influencer to take the perfect shot in a specific location, to the point though that that location is incredibly crowded. So again, loads of behavior modification happening there through platforms that are maybe coalescing with our desire to be seen and behave in certain ways, that are then affecting real life.
Yeah, pardon my French, but it's fucking nuts when you see like your favorite spot being like blasted on Instagram by some influencer, and you're like, okay, I'm just never gonna go there anymore, ever again, because now it has like 10 million likes. I already know everybody's gonna go there. It's just ruined forever. It doesn't exist anymore in my imaginarium of my favorite things, you know.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, like I've used platforms for like to find out about travel, but then it's quite interesting to hear like from locals. I always then ask the locals first. But to me, the most striking examples, although, you know, I'm Italian, so obviously there's bits of Italy that are plagued by over tourism, same with Greece. But as a Londoner, the most striking thing was that we have this flower market called Columbia Road, not far from where I live in Hackney. And every Christmas, they did Christmas carols. It was absolutely gorgeous. There would be a priest, a really young priest from a local parish. I'm not religious, but it was really cute. He would come by on a truck, and on the back of the truck there would be a piano, and he would just like ride back and forth singing carols, and all the locals would be there singing. So since I moved to this area in like 2018, I've been doing that every year. And then last year that was totally ruined by TikTok, because this is a tiny street. There were thousands of people, to the point where there were stampedes, people were sheltering in shops, and the local the town hall had to be like, look, the council, they were like, we can't do this anymore, it's a safety hazard. So they stopped. So TikTok ruined the carols for us. They ruined Christmas.
Fantastic. Ruining Christmas. I mean, how low can you stoop?
I know, right?
By the way, coming full circle, I have to fire my own little rant against Zoomers. Carolina, why are they, when they're making videos, all speaking into this tiny microphone that they put in front of their face like this, like they're shy about showing us their teeth, or like they don't know that the phone already has a microphone? It drives me nuts. Like, what is that? Can you break that down for me?
So I haven't done a lot of research about the microphone, but I do
I'm
find
sorry.
it
I
deep.
just
No, it's fine. It's funny. I do find it
it
deeply
looks like
cringe.
this.
Yeah, it looks like playing the world's tiniest violin or something. You know what I mean? It is really strange. Although I must say that even though the phone does have a camera, sometimes it doesn't pick everything up, particularly if you are blending your video with sound. And there is actually a whole set of TikTok trends and people trying to flog stuff on TikTok that are tools to be a better content creator. And those videos have thousands, if not millions of views, which again, I think shows the appeal of influencing as a profession or as an aspiration for people. Which is why then coming back full circle rather, I really dispute the whole, oh, millennials are too online vibe, because at the same time, as I said, Goblin mode is still an aesthetic. A lot of Gen
Sorry, did
Z,
you mean Zoomers or millennials?
oh, Zoomers, I got it wrong. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah,
That, no, no, no,
yeah.
no.
No worries.
Actually, no, I was right. What I meant was, I really dispute the fact that a lot of Zoomers blast us for being too online or for posting absolutely everything, because even as I said, Goblin mode is an aesthetic. A lot of Gen Z aesthetics are still aesthetics, and the content creator profession is very lucrative. And now there are a lot of Gen Z content creators, so that is an aspiration still. And actually, for instance, in Italy, when young people are asked what job they want to do, a lot of people say influencers. They want to be influencers. So as much as they may hate us, we were the OG bloggers, content creators, influencers, and they're trying to be us.
Exactly. Like I do have to say, a lot of millennials that I talk to feel that, kind of like you said, we were the ones who bridged the gap between the analog and the digital worlds, like a bunch of brave pioneers going to places unknown. So some credit from younger generations should be due our way, but I suppose demanding, that we get respected makes us appear less cool in a way.
Yes, I think
Yes,
also the more
it's a
we
vicious
worry,
circle. Yeah.
it is it's a vicious circle, and the more we worry about being uncool, I think the more uncool we become. I think like coolness comes with a certain effortlessness, and I think we are definitely putting too much effort into now trying to be cool. I feel like we will be dubbed uncool at the end of this podcast.
Okay. Let us selfishly return to us millennials and to the question: how can we turn this around and become cool again? Probably this is the wrong question, like you said, but should we kind of, if we think of in strategic terms, should we double down on our apparently silly ways, or should I, for example, start hanging out with a bunch of 24-year-olds, copy whatever they do, and try to use words like what was it, vibing and low key as much as possible?
And slay, but like said unironically, which I really struggle with. Like I am a OG. Ooh, sorry, there's an ambulance. One sec. I'm an OG Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, hence my tattoo, or my many Buffy tattoos. But we never said slay. So yeah, and then Beyonce brought it in, but like it was kind of only hers to say, and now Gen Z say it unironically, and I find it deeply concerning. But yeah, I think like actually there are two conversations to be had there. One of them is about perception and, online behaviors and stuff. And another one is about surrounding ourselves with people of all ages. Cause I remember my dad who's in his 60s, and he only retired basically during the pandemic. And I think because all of his colleagues were so much younger, he had more of a finger on the pulse of like young people, their lives and stuff. And now that he doesn't work anymore, he misses that. And I think in general, it's really good to surround ourselves with people of different ages and different backgrounds, because I think it makes us more understanding and more flexible and less inclined to other people that are different from us. So I think it's actually really, really important to surround ourselves, if not with an all Gen Z friend group, with a bit of a Gen Z sprinkle into our lives. But I think when it comes back to, are we cool? How do we become cool? To be honest, that's not something I'm too bothered by. First of all, because I don't know, I think I'm cool. I don't think I need to do a lot of work for that. But I think in general also, I try to think of coolness in the same way that I think about platforms. Every time I try to go viral or craft something that's going to get me a lot of engagement, that never happens because that is beyond my control, because algorithms are created by tech lizards. While things tend to go well for me on social media when I create things that resonate with me and resonate with my audience and the people around me. So I think I know this is going to be very cringe for Gen Z, and also very cringe for me as well, because I've kind of dropped out of the whole drag race phenomenon because I'm annoyed at RuPaul and in general the business of the gentrification of drag. But the whole, if you don't love yourself, how in the hell can you love somebody else? Like, I think it is quite interesting, or like there's a lot of self-deprecation around millennials, and I think that's fun and it needs to stay. But at the same time, we need to cut ourselves some slack because we have been through really trying times. And I think it's important to accept who we are as a generation and what we've been through. And there's always room for improving ourselves, but not for the sake of getting less roasted by Gen Z on social media.
Is roasting still cool? Is that acceptable?
Ooh, I mean, I don't know if they would call it roasted. Maybe they call it something else. But I think people are very, I think there are different ways of roasting, right? You can be funny about it and then people will join in because you're laughing with them and not just at them. But then there are some people that are pretty vicious. Not about millennials, to be honest, but like, I don't know. I like, again, something that's coming out of digital culture is, some of the forums where people just go on them to criticize others. And that's something that I don't like.
Yeah. By the way, last question. What about trolling? Who came up with that? Was that us or was that Gen Z? And is that still in vogue?
Oh, so do you mean the actual, like, do you mean trolling millennials for what we do or just trolling in general?
Just trolling in general.
Oh, trolling is a very old practice. It's like it started in internet forums even before social media were a thing.
Oh,
that was actually the
I was
topic
way
of
off.
my PhD. Yeah. So basically just joining boards to wreak havoc on them. Yeah, that's like a pre-social media behavior, and then it's become worse, I would say, because a lot of these boards didn't have formed or fully formed identities. And so I guess the stakes were less high. But now that you see, for instance, people joining platforms anonymously to troll people that actually have an identity and a life on platforms, that's kind of more concerning. But yeah, trolling is a very, very old practice. And I think in general, people have lost the meaning of it, because when it's trolling to wreak havoc and just to like create a bit of mess, sometimes that can be entertaining and it takes a form of mastery. But then if you take it to when you're actually abusing people online, that's not fun anymore. And that still happens a lot.
Very last question. Are we using the same memes, Zoomers and Millennials, or are we also on a diverging path here and we've created different languages when it comes to memes? Do they have like memes that I wouldn't understand, for example? Because I think all of our memes that my friends who are also millennials send to me, I immediately get, even if I haven't seen them before.
I think there's layers to that as well. So I think basically, I feel like Gen Z's joke about a meme. So they're like, it's very meta. They're one layer after us.
Right.
So there's that. But I think in general, when it comes to memes, you also need to be aware what it is that they're talking about. Like you can know maybe the baseline of the meme, like the image used and the sentence used. But then if, for instance, you're not familiar with a certain topic or a certain subculture, then that will be lost on you. I remember, last year there was all that hoo-ha about Princess Kate being dead or like having disappeared or something, because she had cancer, and like basically people kind of dragged it out of her to announce it. But there was this really weird meme about something bad happening in the royal family every time an American TV personality, Trisha Paytas, was pregnant. And so, like, basically there was this layer of memes that would refer to her womb and then Princess Kate. And like, if you weren't into that thread of memes, like, you would have never, ever gotten it. So I had to like go back and do some detective work of being like, okay, where does this come from? What are people talking about? So I think it's not so like, it's not only generational. I think it's also just expertise and familiarity with a topic. So hopefully that's some sort of consolation.
Carolina, I feel like I'm right here when I'm starting to slip away. I don't spend that much time on TikTok anymore. My grasp of like references is gonna be worse and worse. I already missed out on like Brad Summer and stuff. And maybe, it's time for me to say that's okay.
That meme where it's just like a sea full of smiley dolphins that basically represents like an ideal state. And sometimes I feel like that when I'm offline. So I go offline routinely. I do a lot of digital detoxes. I was just on holiday in Greece, and for 10 days, it was bliss. I was just not online.
Respect.
So sometimes I wonder if that like is actually the bliss state that we should be aiming for. Like right now, I can't afford to be offline because I'm a postdoc and my postdoc is soon coming to an end. I'm on the job market, and a lot of my fame as an academic and my let's say reputation comes from media relations, from translating my articles into social media posts that are easily accessible to my audience. So I feel like doing that is very much part of my job, but I crave a time where actually being very online won't be necessary for my work anymore. So maybe that will be the bliss state that we will reach when we will not know the meaning of a meme, and it will be fine. We will have more, like we'll have nicer things to do.
Oh yeah, back to the 90s, I say. Carolina, thank you so much.
Back to the 90s.
Where can people find you online?
People can find me, they can read my blog at bloggeronpole.com, and they can find me all over the internet at bloggeronpole. That's Instagram, TikTok, Bluesky. I'm still on Twitter, but basically just because I'm nostalgic about it, I try to post less on it. And I'm also on LinkedIn as my name, so as myself, Carolina Are. So yeah, thank you for having me. This has been a really, really fun conversation, and we will be cancelled by Gen Z in 3, 2, 1.
I'll wear it as a badge of honor.
Nice.
Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow and rate on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Marketing tutorials insist it's really important that I hassle you about this, so I'm doing it. Also, if you'd like to, please support me on Patreon. This is a one-person podcast. I do everything by my little old self. There's no team behind me. It's very sad, I know. But you can help by hopping on Patreon and finding the Smart Cookies podcast on there. And then last but certainly not least, like always, I have to thank my existing patrons, Tovarish and Tovarishice. Without you, there would be no Smart Cookies podcast, which makes you actual producers of this show. So eternal glory and thanks go to András Rakuszczak, Florian Hauer, Peter Karba, Matija Zupancic, Dejan Žolnir, Darej, Rok Tržan, Sasha Vipotnik, Neven Cvijanović, Juš Prebral, Nate Sirk, Goran Ivašić, Anže Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaš Mahar, Štrole, Ajda Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordon, Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Taichi. The community is growing, which makes me deeply touched and grateful. Thanks again, everybody.